Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar, Getting Sent to Whom You Sound Like, the Language of Executive Buyers. I'm Rob Oates, Chairman of the IIABCal Emerging Leaders. With us today is Tom Searcy, President and CEO of Hunt Big Sales. Tom is a nationally recognized author, speaker, and the foremost expert in large account sales. His method of unlocking explosive growth were developed through years of real-world successes. For today's webinar, we have muted your phones to eliminate background noise. However, you can ask questions during the webinar by writing through the right-hand navigation area of the GoToMeeting. All of your questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Tom?
Thanks so much, Rob. Really appreciate the opportunity to address the group, and I want to get right into getting sent to whom you sound like, the language of executive buyers. And you know, all this is ramping up for the InsureFest 2014 sessions, which I think are going to be an awful lot of fun. The thing is that I want to really start off with this simple understanding. Buying processes drive selling processes. And the reason I say that is that, you know, when we implement a sales process inside of our own companies or inside of our own business approaches out there, we are doing it in responses to changes that have happened inside of the customer base, inside of the marketplace. And so we lag how they change the way they buy. And one of the major shifts that has happened that we have to address is this change in power of who the decision maker is. Now, when we're selling to smaller accounts, it's easy to see the owner of a business, and it's easier to see the financial person in the business and the operator in the business. And the reason I say it's easier is because maybe there's 5 people in the company, and that person I just described is one person. But as we move up inside of the organizations, the size and scale of accounts that we want to land, we have to move to new levels of people and to different types of people. And to do that well, we have to kind of think like they think. So the model in today's conversation is really talking about how did those decision makers, that new generation of decision makers, buy? In the larger organizations, the higher level executives, how do they think? And the second thing is we're going to talk about how do we message to them appropriately, talk about what our bigger sales look like as the way the decisions are made inside of these big companies, and then in the end we're going to kind of just give a little tutorial of the 5 things those senior people like to talk about whenever you're in a situation that you have them one-on-one. So we're going to cover a lot of material in the minutes that we have, but I want to make certain that we leave time for some questions and answers at the end. And, of course, we'll cover a lot of this material, and matter of fact, most of this material in greater extent when we're all together at InsureFest. All right, so let's get started. How do decision makers buy? Now, I break down a grid, a model that I've been using for some time now on how decision makers buy. And as you look at this grid, you'll see that it really starts off in bigger companies. Let's say organizations that have more than 100 employees, and this goes beyond that, where we've got managers at one level in the position, and we go to directors, vice presidents, and the presidents and CXOs. And so each of these levels has a different kind of ambition. They have a time reference or a horizon through which they're looking at it. They have different ways that they think about what they value. And, of course, how they buy things shows or expresses itself differently. And then finally, there's a different kind of a life cycle in each of the positions. And I think the one thing that I would point out to in this particular graphic is that the director's life cycle is actually a little shorter than the vice presidents or the managers. And that's because in bigger companies, the director's position is oftentimes a proving ground position. In 3 to 5 years, they either move up or they move out. And they move out because they can't get the job that they want inside of this company, and they decide to go somewhere else. Directors are where headhunters have a tendency to poach vice presidents for other companies. So as you look at this group, if you're selling to managers, they make their decision on what they value in that column there based upon relationships, that things work, and it's cheaper. But as you move up the organizational chart, you start to get a different valuation as to how people look at things. So now I don't want to read this graphic to you, but I want you to consider it through a couple of lenses. When you look at those managers and up into the director level and you think about how they make their decisions and how you sell to them, those particular groups of people are people that are making decisions inside of a budget, a line item budget for for the products or services or solutions that you offer to them. And they have a line item that's named. When you're down at that lower level, these are people that when you look under office supplies, a manager doesn't have an office supply budget anymore in these bigger companies. There's too many controls. They have a pencils budget, a paper budget, and a pens budget. It's down to that level of granularity because the controls are so tight inside of those organizations that they really can't buy based upon discrete benefits that you bring, those soft benefits that you bring. So managers and directors are inside of their budget. You're going to be in a position of pitching and quoting. Now, if you move up the organization to a higher level of director, and you're inside of vice presidents and directors and above, we call that soft budget funded. Now, those are people who can make purchase decisions inside of categories. They can move money around. They can't make money or add money beyond what was originally budgeted for the entire year as far as the budget in general. So if it said our G&A budget is $1 million, they can't make it $1.1 million. They don't have the authority to do that. But within that $1 million, they can move things around inside of their categories so that they can make new choices that are outside of a line item budget. And then there's the senior people. These are non-budget funded. These are people who can, based upon business objectives and their interests, and we kind of call it invent money. And all that means is that they can go beyond the budget as it was stated at the beginning of the year. Now, what we offer is typically a budgeted item. I mean, a lot of times the solutions that we bring to people are budgeted. And so when we're talking to executives and decision makers, we have to remember that if I'm talking to a manager down into a director level, they really don't have the authority to buy outside of what was already given to them as their expense line. If I move up, they're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul. They're going to have to pull money from one area to spend money in another area, but they can't increase the amount of money no matter how much value you bring in the conversation, no matter how much risk you show that they are at, they can't change the overall numbers. But you get to that senior decision maker, and you are in an area in which that person can see the value you bring and can make new decisions. So this graphic, and of course this is being recorded for you, so if you'd like to take a look at that and snapshots of some of the slides along the way, you'll be able to do that as well later. But it gives you kind of a clear picture that we have to change our message based upon the perspective of the people to whom we are addressing. And secondly, we want to move up. If we are selling on something other than price, which almost everybody on this call is selling on something other than price, we have to step up our message to a level that focuses and lines up with the needs of that president, CXO, owner, or senior vice president. So thinking about that, it really puts us into the question of who is our real decision maker. So let's just take a second and think about that. In the space of what we sell, as my understanding of your industry and the people that I've worked with inside of your industry, there are a number of people who have related conversations to the things that we sell, and recognizing and honoring the fact that the people on this call have a strong overlap of the things they sell, but they also have their own unique pieces that they sell as far as their solution package. I would say that predominantly, fundamentally, we are selling to people who have a risk management mindset, first and foremost. They are trying to manage the nature of their overall risk, and yet they're trying to offset that by trying to determine how do I do that most cost effectively as far as the amount of dollars I'm spending. And it's always that conversation of the dollars spent today for the unseen risk of tomorrow. That's the constant dynamic tension that occurs. So in executive decision maker messaging, we have to focus on a language that is not about what we call Excel spreadsheet selling, which is where I list features and benefits down the axis on the left-hand side, and I take competitors across the top, and at the intersection of each of the cells, I put in the comparative values between one competitor and another, eliminate those that don't have the things that I need, take the final three, and buy from the lowest price. More and more, we're seeing the decision-making process driven to that Excel spreadsheet model, and it's driven there because we're having conversations with people who are not high enough up the food chain that they see a value other than price and what they believe to be standardized benefit. Now, I'm not speaking out of turn to anybody on this call. Everybody in this discussion right now has been in a meeting where they were facing that right from the very beginning of the meeting, someone who clearly articulates that they believe that all of the products and services, solutions that are out there are basically the same, and therefore the only value is price. You know you're moving uphill from that particular point. So for us to be effective, we've got to get to that higher level executive decision maker, right? That one that I was talking about just a few moments ago when we were talking about this president and CXO or vice president or owner, and they're starting to think about things that they value, which has to do with the moving the needles and managing the risk, and of course making certain that they're in a position that they're able to dominate in their marketplace. So having said that, we always kind of break out the difference between what is the lower side of the conversation, managers and directors, who what we believe they're going through in their process evaluation is a supplier vendor selection process. The old iron triangle of product and quality, service and price, and they're comparing us one against the other, us against the other competitors in their marketplace. They do believe that they're doing a market scan. They validate that we've got credible potential vendors, and then they buy from the lowest price. For us to be successful on those bigger opportunities in the marketplace, we have to move the language to time, money, and risk. And the reason I've written it out in this graphic the way that I have is that time is not a question of service. Money is not a question of price, and risk is not an issue of quality. And the reason I say that is that if I had an owner or a president or a CXO, and you could just simply say, what's the time, money, and risk around service, price, and quality, they would simply put it into a buyer's process. They would drop it into an Excel spreadsheet, and they would have one of their directors or managers administer the process through procurement or purchasing and come to a final choice. If we're not solving that executive problem around the higher levels of time, money, and risk, we're going to get stuck. And we're going to get stuck talking to lower level people, and that's because you get sent to whom you sound like. If you're not using the language that is the language of that senior buyer, you are going to be pushed down to someone else, delegated out. It's funny, we oftentimes talk about it in the discussions that I have in the lectures and the opportunity that I have to present, and we're talking about the crocodile executive. And the crocodile executive is asking himself or herself, when we're at that senior level inside of these bigger companies, every time they meet a new idea or a new person, they're trying to figure out, do I eat this, do I kill this, do I avoid this, or do I embrace this? And for the most part, they're trying to manage their time and investment by getting everything off their plate they possibly can. So unless they see a language that embraces the problem that they have, they will delegate this down to anybody to get it off their schedule and out of their office. And so we have to speak in that language of senior executive. So the three outcomes that you, and I focus on you as a consultant, right, need to change in your customer is around money, time, and risk. And since we're trading money for now against risk for the future, we have to be the experts inside their industry and marketplace around what are the things that are coming in the future. Not in our industry, but in our buyer's industry. So because you get sent to whom you sound like, you want to make certain that you are addressing the issues of that higher level buyer. Now, we talk about that big sales cycle when you're going out and selling the larger account opportunities that are out there. And that means that the first step, and we kind of talked about this in our first webinar, is that you have to get an executive sponsor. You have to get that senior decision maker who believes he or she has the problem that you solve, and they become your executive sponsor. And that's the way that that works at the very beginning. Now, this graphic you see in front of you really measures sales effort on the left-hand side against time down at the bottom of this particular graphic. And we kind of measure it from initial contact through the buying cycle to the contract. So when we first meet with an executive sponsor, the first thing we talk about is what is the advantage that we bring? What's our value proposition around time, money, and risk? So if we bring something that is amazing as far as upside goes, then we're going to focus on that in that conversation of language of time, money, and risk. And so, but over time, you can see that advantage, our sales effort and energy diminishes over the course of a long sales cycle and how much time and energy we spend on advantage. And instead it's replaced by the amount of energy we spend talking about their fear. See, what we know about big sales is that although you secure an executive sponsor based on advantage, it's because you overcome their fears of change, their fears of conflict, their fears of having additional work or mistakes, because you overcome those kinds of fears that you actually get the deal done. And so because there's so many more people now at the buyer's table on these bigger deals, because everyone is so involved in that consensus buying, you're not just dealing with your executive sponsor. I mean, in phase one, sure, you're going to start securing that executive sponsor the way that we discussed the last time we had our webinar together. And that's the first part. So we're going to spend a lot of time at the very beginning talking about how great it would be if we were working together, and what would we be bringing to the table. What's the insights and values around time, money, and risk that you would get from us that you aren't getting currently. And many of you have talked about the fact that the customers in the marketplace, what do they value about us? Well, they see us as insightful. They see us as proactive. They see us as looking forward to the future. They see us as being able to provide them a different angle on what's happening at a regulatory level and compliance, and looking at what are going to be the best practices that are going to be out there. Those are all the languages of senior executives as they evaluate time, money, and risk. We don't usually talk about, how much better our onboarding process is than anybody else, or how much, better we are as an organization in our ability to service customers and those kinds of things. That's not really a fear of a senior buyer, all right? That's a fear of somebody else inside of the process. And as a matter of fact, that starts to happen at phase two. And phase two is when we bring in all those other decision makers, or really they're not even decision makers, they're influencers. There's IT that gets involved in that conversation, and there's finance people that get involved, and facilities people, and it just goes on and on. And it seems like everybody inside of a large organization has the power to say no, or I'm not sure, but very few people have the power to say yes. So our executive sponsor says, hey, I think we ought to go with this firm. I think they've got some great ideas and some great solutions. And then we start to bring other people into the table, and they have to be there, and they start saying, well, I don't know if right now it's time to change. Shouldn't we look at this at the next cycle? Gosh, out of all the things that we've got going on right now, I just feel like this is a waste of our time and energy. If we weren't so understaffed, and stop me if you've never heard one of those. I mean, organizations don't say no. They say, this is a good idea, let's do it later, which is effectively the same thing as no. And so it's in that buyer's table where we start to mix the messages, we start to blend the messages of the executive sponsor, which is all about those time, money, risk advantages, and we start to offset with all the fear-driven questions about how are you going to do it, and who will be involved, and what are the milestones along the way, and so on. So that's that middle stage of the sales process. But what really dictates how fast a process gets executed to move forward and how big a purchase is what we call EELs. Warren Buffett's famous for saying that if you sit down to play poker and within 3 hands you haven't figured out who the chump is, get up. You are the chump. We think the same thing is true about sales processes. Most of us sit down and we try to figure out who the executive sponsor is, the person with the biggest check signing capability and the greatest level of problem. But the person who has the most influence in the modern buying process is the EEL, the person who does not want to do this now, doesn't want to do it at this size, doesn't want to change what we're doing altogether, or doesn't want to work with you. And so as you look at this sales cycle, you start to see that your messaging to executives has to be a combination of what is your executive buyer's need all the way through the remainder of the buyer's table's concerns and fears. And so think about this. When you're at that phase one with the executive sponsor, if they get stuck, if they don't move forward, if they don't want to move with you and support you, it's because they don't see that the problem that you solve is really a big enough problem. Executives spend their time on the biggest problems that are out there. If they don't feel like the problem that you're showing them around time, money, and risk is big enough, they won't move forward. Now, if you get stuck in the middle, the reason that you get stuck is because there isn't good chemistry, and the chemistry is kind of an expansive statement, but a chemistry meaning not just the chemistry of personalities between people, but the feeling that your solution is a direct fit for their problem, that your case studies are a direct fit for their organization, and that their organization will be able to embrace and deal with what you've got as far as your solution. And then finally, if you're stuck with yield, that's because they're afraid. They're afraid of change, they're afraid of conflict, they're afraid of work, or they're afraid of mistakes. And so by having this understanding of the sales cycle, when we start looking at being sent to whom we sound like, we've got to make certain that we've got a message for each one of the various people that we're going to meet in the overall sales process on these bigger deals. Because if we don't have that message figured out, we'll show up, and we'll show up somebody who's an eel talking about how great our time, money, and risk solution is, and the eel doesn't care because all he or she is concerned with is their fear of making a change. If we come into the buyer's table and we talk about, all we talk about is how great things are going to be or how we're going to take away the fears, but we don't focus on how they should trust us and how we line up with them, we'll wind up in a situation where there's a misalignment. So this idea of getting the executive sponsorship and then holding that language all the way from front to back in the sales process, absolutely critical. So let's close with a couple ideas and then some questions. And that is when you're talking to senior decision makers, when you're talking to those higher level executives, even if it's, quote unquote, at an elevator or a cocktail party or whatever, we've noticed some patterns about how you keep a president's, a CXO's, or a vice president's attention. One of the first things is that you can't be talking about just today. For these folks, most of what you're discussing is on a longer horizon out towards the future. If it's just the issues of the day, they believe that they've got people that are reporting to them that are supposed to be handling the day-to-day. They see themselves in a position of looking to the future. And so your conversation has to be regulatory impact, impact of technology, changes in their industry, marketplace, and competitors, and even changes in their customers. If you're talking in the now, you're talking downstream, you will be delegated to someone there. If you're talking 6 months out to 18 months out, you're talking executive speak. Second issue is senior decision makers are looking for a 360-degree perspective. They want to see all the way around an issue. How is this going to impact their market share position? How will it impact their suppliers and their vendors? How will it impact new facilities, new partners they bring on? So they're curious around all of the angles of the issue in the business, not just the tactical issues of one particular purchase of a solution. Third thing is they look at things in a framework of data, analysis, implications, and recommendations. Meaning if you provide them the data, here's the number of accidents that happen, here's the number of underinsured facilities that are out there, here's what the average case size is, that's data. And that's the kind of thing that someone down food chain is really interested in. Analysis says, okay, so based upon this data, what we've determined is that there will be an increase in the need for the following kinds of solutions in the future, and the following kinds of transparency, and the kinds of technologies around that. And so that's analysis. Implication says organizations in your industry right now are shifting their spend in their solution from dollars spent in this area to dollars spent in this other area. That's implication. And then recommendations. We're recommending to all of our customers inside of the manufacturing space to really consider the following three things. When you're speaking to senior decision makers, you're out to the right-hand side. You're out towards implications and recommendations. When you're speaking to people in the managerial and director level, you're speaking in the data and analysis level. So if you've got all of that message framed out from data, analysis, implications, and recommendations, you have the tools to have a conversation with someone inside of a prospect regardless of what level they're at, and you can shift appropriately. But if you show up with data and analysis and you're talking to a president, you will be moved downstream to one of the manager's directors. One of the prompts that we always encourage people to talk about is to speak to the senior decision maker in any meeting you're in and simply ask this question: what are you excited about in the next cycle? And obviously you're going to tailor what that cycle is to that particular audience. You may say the next cycle could be the next budgetary cycle, the next legislative cycle. You could say inside of the next season. It's appropriate to your industry. One of the things senior decision makers like to do is they like to talk about what is their agenda and their initiative. And by asking the prompt of what are you excited about in the next cycle, you're going to get their engagement and you're going to hold their attention, and that will allow you to tailor your conversation to what is relevant and valuable to them and not get delegated downstream. And finally, we encourage you to ask them, whom are the people you are following in your industry as thought leaders? And who are the people that you are reading and believe are out in the marketplace represent innovative thought? Remember, you're a consultant. You're more than a consultant. You're really an expert or an authority. And if you're going to be an expert or an authority, you need to understand what they value in an expert or an authority. So we covered a lot of ground in a short window of time. I know coming up on September 15th, I'm going to give you another webinar at that time on the 5 techniques for making bigger sales. And obviously, we're going to do InsureFest together. But I wanted to get a chance for some questions. David and Rob, can you guys help me out if there's any questions that we've got?
Definitely. Tom, thank you very much. Now I'd like to open up the webinar for any questions anyone may have. If you haven't already done so, you can submit them in the right hand in the column on the right-hand navigation area of the GoToMeeting. That was outstanding content. I actually have a question too. You talked about in the chart that where you had the 3 phases of the sales cycle, so to speak. In phase 2, you talked about chemistry. Perfect.
Yes.
And how you can get stuck because of chemistry. Can you change that chemistry? If you get through phase 1, the advantage, you have the executive sponsor, you get into the buyer's table, and you get stuck because of the chemistry, can you change that chemistry? Do you have to start back over, or what can you do?
Great question, Rob. The fact is that I think sometimes I use the word chemistry. I almost want to change that word sometimes to the word alignment, because sometimes chemistry is distracting because it sounds like the kind of chemistry you have when you're dating someone, and that's not the chemistry I'm speaking to. What we can do is we can change the alignment, which means digging deeper to find out what is the real driver of everybody at the table, not just the executive sponsor, right? Because the executive sponsor might be excited about our ability to help them manage their risk profile, and yet when I'm down in a vice president or director inside of an administrative role, their issue is speed to resolution on claims and issues along the way, and so that's their version, and they want to understand the alignment of how we provide our solution. And I know that's kind of a clumsy example, but I think it's a valid one. So it's getting the alignment between all of the people at the table of how we're looking at what we do and what they're trying to change.
Gotcha. Great. Great. And so the process that you talk about, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of that sales cycle, is there any place that you don't think you can recover from, or anything that you could maybe in a minute or two kind of explain to where each one, these are quelching those fears so that, and the fears start off lower, but quelching those fears as you go through phase 2 and 3 in order to increase your probability of landing that big sale?
There are occasions, for example, where I'll give you a classic example. I've got someone who has gone through 3 purchase cycles in the course of the last 10 years, and in all 3 occasions they've gone back to the incumbent, right? And so the question that everyone on this call knows that we should ask, but we don't always ask, is what has changed that causes you to want to leave your current provider? I mean, you've gone out to bid 3 times in the course of the last 10 years, and you've never left. So if the answer isn't satisfactory, then the fact is that this is just a pricing scan out of the marketplace, and there's no real interest in changing. So that's one of the things that we have to figure out. Is there a real interest in making a change from what they're doing right now? If there isn't, then it's time to leave.
Gotcha. 2 more questions. Number 1, someone asked, can you re-explain your crocodile analogy? You talked about eating it, killing it. Can you re-explain that?
Sure. It's a dangerous thing to bring in, but it's the idea of the reptilian brain, and all it really says is that everyone is pressed for time, and everyone is fearful of interruption of what their agenda is. And so we operate from a place of protectiveness, and they call that the crocodile model. And all that says is that when I meet a new idea or I meet a new person, the crocodile brain quickly assesses, do I fight this? Do I run from this? Do I eat it or embrace it? And we see this happen quite a bit out there in the executive decision making, And that's why sometimes you meet somebody, they seem really excited, but they've delegated you down, an entire meeting took 12 minutes. And you're like, oh, wow, I met with the president of the company. He seemed really excited about what we had to do, and he's going to have me go talk to his director of things that don't matter. And now I'm with the director of things that don't matter. You didn't have a positive meeting. That crocodile just moved you out because he decided you were not important enough or valuable enough to really embrace.
Okay, great. And the last question you asked of when you're in your executive meetings, who are the executives following from a thought leadership standpoint? From your standpoint, who do you follow as thought leaders in our industry?
That's a great question. So a couple of guys out there wrote the Challenger Sale, Dixon and Abrams, and I think that they did a great job in their research and their work around there. I've always been a fan of Daniel Pink and Marshall Goldsmith. Marshall Goldsmith more from executive thinking and from a consulting perspective, and Daniel Pink, I thought his book Drive was very, very insightful. Malcolm Gladwell. So I mean, some of the business thinkers that are out there, there's quite a few of them. I read quite a bit, and there's a lot of good thinkers out there. But those are some of the folks I'm following right now. Phil Conrath as well.
That's great. That's great. Well, definitely appreciate your time, Tom. I think it was outstanding content, and spending the time with us and providing us with your insight. If you would like to hear more from Tom, he will be presenting one additional agency sales webinar titled 5 Mistakes to Stop Making in Big Sales on Monday, September 15th, which he alluded to. And also he's going to be one of our keynote speakers at the upcoming InsureFest in San Francisco. To register for that webinar or to download the recorded version of today's webinar, you can visit www.insurefest.org and click on InsureFest Agency Sales Track Webinars. As I said, Tom will be presenting at InsureFest on November 6th through the 8th at the Sheraton Fisherman's Wharf, San Francisco. For more information and to register, please visit www.insurefest.org. That concludes our web seminar for today. Thank you all for participating.